I'm not sure if this is something I've mentioned before, but since the early 90s, I've been practicing Tai Chi, and later on I started practicing Qigong. And essentially, one of the ideals within Tai Chi is that eventually you're always practicing. So you learn the form, and the form contains certain principles. So unlike other martial arts where you're learning applications, really in Tai Chi you're learning not how to do a specific set of movements for a specific purpose. You're learning a set of movements so that it's kind of all-purpose. How do you say this better? So instead of like learning kanas, I guess is what they call them in a lot of other martial arts, where there are certain combinations of, kicks and blocks and punches and what have you. You're learning how to create the ideal structure within your own body. And then you're taking that structure and you're figuring out how to make it as flexible as possible for forces that might come from any direction. So you want it to be efficient in mobilizing force, but you also want to be efficient in neutralizing force. And that means, in essence, that your body should be able to move to any location at any time. That's the ideal, right? And to maintain its structure, its the basic principles inside of the heart, mind, body. Because all of those things have to be in alignment for things to move smoothly. Now, this is a tall order. Tai Chi is sometimes referred to as the grand ultimate. I think that translation is perhaps not really the best. I think the meaning is more great distinction. So Tai means great, and Ji is distinction. So for instance, Wuji means no distinction. So that's a state of emptiness, no distinctions. But, quite often Tai Chi is referred to as the grand ultimate because in theory, it's the best. If you're able to maintain alignment, move to any position, using 4 ounces to deflect 1,000 pounds, extremely efficient use of energy, that would be the ultimate way of approaching physical conflict, right? But it's difficult to get to a point where it's really useful in physical conflict, and that's why people tend to study the so-called external martial arts. Tai Chi is considered an internal martial art. So I have to some extent embraced this idea of practicing all the time, which is not to say that I do that all the time, but whenever I can, there's certain things that as you practice, it kind of gets into your body, and so you do it more and more. So there are things that I've incorporated, and I try to maintain as I'm going through the day. And then as you're doing this, you realize where the problems are, so you start to kind of go, oh, okay, I've got issues in my shoulders or what have you, my lower back. Those are the places that are the most difficult for me, and really, I think the most difficult for a lot of people. So I've been on this long, long journey for many years, trying to work out these problems, with varying degrees of success, but it seems like it's going pretty well, especially considering I have a chronic inflammatory illness, like so many people. So I'm essentially kind of battling this arthritis while I'm trying to work out. It's been extremely challenging. Let's put it that way. But I think that it seems like things are going reasonably well. And I just realized something kind of interesting. So part of the challenge in being able to maintain, essentially the principles you're trying to maintain are full breath, relaxation, in like the essence of what you're doing. Even if you're mobilizing force, you want everything to stay very relaxed and kind of calm. And then the structure in the body is you remain rooted in the ground. There's a set of kind of like arrangements within the body. So the head top rises, the tailbone drops, the weight is felt in the bubbling wells, which are the points on the feet that are kind of behind the ball of the foot. And then you have a structure where the knee stays over the toe. So there's all these kind of like structural components that have to be in place so that you can stay relaxed and have the flexibility to move to any position and to be able to receive force in each of these positions and be able to mobilize force in any of these positions. And so what that equates to, in essence, is you have to be able to move anywhere internally within the body in order to resolve the problems that you're faced with when you're trying to move externally. So if you have pain in your ankles or something like that, in order to move flexibly, you're going to have to resolve that pain somehow. And this is just true everywhere. So in order to move in the world, you have to move inside of yourself. So moving inside of yourself, you can think of this as being Neigong, internal work. So, Qigong means basically breath work. Qigong and Kung Fu. So Kung Fu is the same word, Kung and Gong. It's the same idea. It's basically like work or skill. So in Qigong, you get good at the skill of breath work or of energy work. In Kung Fu, it's the skill of being able to mobilize force. In Neigong, it's internal work. And I've been told that Neigong is extremely dangerous if you don't do it right. And I completely see why that's the case. Because when you start trying to resolve internal problems, you can really mess yourself up if you don't do it the right way. And I'm not going to say that I know the right way, because I've not gotten a lot of specific instruction on the Neigong front. But I do believe that the basic principles, if you adhere to them, you'll be okay, which is never use excessive force, stay relaxed, keep breathing. You have to know when to stop. And the reason for all of this is that when you're working out problems in the body, it stirs up toxins. It stirs up bad feelings. Because quite often the body is holding on to trauma, not only from your life, but intergenerational trauma. So when you get born, you're born into a family situation that has a long history, and if that history has a lot of difficulty, pain, various forms of misery, maybe some secrets, right? All these things get held in the body unconsciously. even if you don't know precisely what they are. Because when people go through experiences, it becomes kind of embedded in the body, and that gets carried on through the generations just in physical interaction and in just the mood, the feeling of being in a family, right? So we tend to take on many of the characteristics, maybe a bit less than it used to be traditionally, taking on the characteristics of our parents, of our family, of the group that we were born into. Now there's a lot more mobility, not really necessarily social mobility, but you can travel around a lot more, and so a lot of people will, leave where their family is and go live somewhere else. So I think that particularly if that happens when you're young, then some of these things are not quite the same, but in essence, the basic pattern is there. And certainly, in my own experience, even though my family was broken up when I was young, there was still the overall milieu of the family and of the relatives and of the society that I grew up in. And what I've discovered is that this process of trying to work out the tensions in the body is my Master Yu, who was the Taiji master I studied with for many years. He said that the reason why we exercise is to release tension from the body. And so in this process of doing the internal work to try to resolve physical problems, I've noticed that the same process is extremely important within the psyche. And of course, the psyche is directly related to the emotional experience. But the way I think about the emotional experience is that you can't really work with the emotions. They're signs. They things come up and you go, oh, there's something there. You can feel, right, that something is creating an effect. There's this idea in traditional Chinese medicine that emotionality is actually a sign of an imbalance. And so I guess in theory, the ideal state would be one of equanimity, where there really isn't a lot of fluctuations in emotional state, and essentially there's a feeling of contentment. I think that's the traditional idea. And it's difficult to imagine residing in that kind of a place for long. I can get little tastes of it when I'm deep into Taiji or Qigong practice. But yeah, we are a society that somehow or another got convinced that emotional states are the most important thing. I think that this actually was kind of a psyop to soften us up and get us ready for the big takedown. Because you can't really have a society where everyone's in an emotional state all the time. It's just profoundly dysfunctional. So in some respects, this kind of a practice, the internal practice that I've briefly described here, is really the remedy for most of our problems. If everyone did it. Which, of course, is a vanishingly small possibility. It's difficult enough for any one person to do it. It is extremely difficult, and sometimes it can be extremely painful, not just physically. Because if you're willing to go anywhere internally, then you have to hit all the sore spots, right? And we all have a lot of tension, and so, the pain is kind of unbelievable when you really go after it. particularly throughout the spine. But I mean, pretty much, I don't know. I don't know what it's like to be in anyone else's body, but I can't believe how much pain there is residing in the human body. So, there's a reason why everyone gets on painkillers eventually. And of course, that does not solve the problem at all. It just masks it. So it's another instance of our just kicking the can down the road. It's very much like our attitude towards finances. And you have to wonder whether, they quite often will talk about the pain of market corrections, right? Market corrections mean like things go to their actual value. So right now you have a situation where, if you want to buy stock in Tesla, it's at a 60-to-1 price to earnings ratio, which means that you're paying 60 times more for the stock than what the actual company is worth. And, people love this kind of stuff because essentially speculation can make a lot of people a lot of money until you have a correction. So no one wants to take the pain of a correction so we can go back to a market that makes any sense. And very similarly, like no one wants to resolve the physical pain. They'd rather just like forestall it with, better living through chemistry. And it's hard to say whether or not the pain ever ends, because I think that once you get a certain layer out of the way, there's another layer underneath it. And I think the deeper you go, the closer you're getting to ancient trauma. That in some ways you could say has defined our species. As this idea of the kind of collective experience we all had in the ancient past where something radically traumatic occurred around the globe. I think that is something, we're a species that has memory. We hold on to things. And so the more you hold on to, the more you're carrying around. And that's a burden, and it gets in your way. If you're carrying a lot of stuff, it's difficult to deal with other things. I know some people who are just so, really extremely nice, creative, intelligent people who are so wrapped up in the things that have happened in their past that they can scarcely function in the present. So the details are specific to each of us. And I honestly don't think that they're all that relevant to share with other people. I think in the same way that we each have our own personal relationship with God, and that the world would greatly benefit if people would just stop talking about what they think God wants or has planned for everyone, because that just creates so much chaos, and no one really knows, right? So it's best to keep your relationship with God to yourself. You could say, yes, I do believe I have a relationship with God. And, I really do think anyone who thinks they know what God's will is, or that they understand precisely what's written in Scripture, I mean, maybe someone's right. There's certainly some profound things that get said about this, but if you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans. So similarly, although not exactly the same, it's like the process that we all go through in trying to resolve our inner demons, I think the details of that are best dealt with ourselves. There's nothing more tedious than listening to someone spill their guts. And I actually think, that's probably another way in which people have been encouraged, that there's something kind of brave about just like letting it all hang out and being honest about all of the terrible things that you're struggling with. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's helpful for some people, but like most things, I think the devil is in the details. And there's just something demonic about all of this belly aching. And it again just doesn't really help to create a functional society. It just, everyone wants to be, have their 15 minutes of fame complaining about how screwed up their lives are. So what's that? Like, why would we want a society that's constantly complaining about itself and sort of proud of itself for having done so? It's, doesn't make sense. So, all of this is to say essentially that the process of releasing tension in the body is parallel to the process of releasing tension within the psyche. So ideas in the mind that one becomes convinced of, ideas that have formed over the course of one's experience about who we are and who the people are around us, what the world is, what the things are that are of value to us that we're chasing after, kind of in our mimetic. Let's make a little Girardian reference here. So, without examining these things, we could continue to chase after these cherished goals that we didn't really think very carefully about when we formulated them. And sometimes, you get to the point where you examine the thing and you realize all the defects of it, but then you're like, well, but this is what I do. Like, that's how I feel about music at this point. I originally started, well, here's a perfect example, okay? I guess I'm going to do the exact opposite of what I say. So I will give an example from my own life, which I suppose some of you may find boring, and, maybe it's a mistake for me to talk about it. But so my family, you could say that our religion was music. It was just the family passion, and so from a very young age, I really, it wasn't just that I liked music, but it had all this value in my family. It was just considered this greatest thing, So becoming a musician, I kind of got mixed messages, which was like, this is the best thing ever, but don't do it as a career. So, of course, as a kid, you rebel, and you're like, well, why not? It's the best thing. Why not try to do that as a career? So that's essentially what I pursued for a long time, and I was not, I had something interesting going on musically, but I was not excellent. I was kind of, I don't know where exactly I was, but basically I struggled for my entire young adulthood trying to make some kind of a musical career happen. And there was always enough happening so that it felt like maybe it would go somewhere, but it never really congealed into an actual career. And at a certain point, I was like, this is just messing my life up. I've got to stop. I've got to do something else. And I had actually been studying Qigong and Tai Chi long enough then, so I started to teach Tai Chi and Qigong, and eventually I got some jobs that, while they didn't pay well, at least it was a job, and I got like a bunch of little jobs at, health clubs and old age homes and senior centers and universities, community college, some corporations. They would have like a gym. I'd teach in there, and so I kind of cobbled together an existence for a while doing that. But I still loved music, and I still thought about music, and I would occasionally kind of play around with music a little bit. And so even though I see music, and I also, along the way, started to see music as a very malevolent force in our society, because it had been used for such terrible things in so many different ways, and now increasingly I think music is kind of used as this degenerative psyop, It's just obvious that the biggest acts are essentially encouraging a terrible way of living. So all of that was depressing, and then kind of realizing that was all baked into a lot of the music that I loved. So all that, rock from the, 60s through the 80s, which was sort of where I was really involved in it. Some pretty crappy ideas being thrown around there, particularly when it came to how men and women are treating each other. Not healthy stuff. And of course, drug use and all that stuff. So, all of this over the course of time. The other thing I noticed too is that a lot of rock and roll bands, they would have a song poking fun at religion. So there was obviously a kind of, I think the producers were pleased when they saw a song that was poking fun at religious, so sort of breaking down that structure, which it happens in society. So whatever. Yeah, part of the thing that you have to accept, I think, is something that I mentioned in a recent podcast about an apple rotting. So once a certain amount of rot has started, if it didn't get cut out, it's going to take the whole thing over. There's just no way to stop it. And that's what civilizations do, The fruit ripens and then it rots. So it's not like you can necessarily say, well, all of this is to blame. It's just sort of a sign of where the civilization is at. And because the people accepted it, that means that they were ready to rot. And that's a natural part of the process in any civilization. And so, one of the things that eventually hit me was that, I've only got a certain amount of time left, and I do love music, despite its flaws, and I'm pretty good at it, and so, why not do it? Maybe that's a mistake, maybe that is, sometimes I do wonder if it's a transgression, a spiritual transgression, to continue to make music. I'm aware of a book written by a master of music from India who realized that in order for him to fulfill his spiritual path, he had to quit music. So perhaps that's the bottom line truth. But again, I think for everyone, it's kind of a personal thing. And for me, there is something quite spiritual about making music. Because, getting back to the emotion thing, because we're living in an emotional society, sending emotional signals is kind of one of the only ways to reach people. And music is essentially the sound of human emotion put into the air. It literally is emotion in the air. And so I feel like it's an effort to reach people. Who need to hear something else. I've always been interested in music that doesn't sound like anything else. That's the sound that's the sound of a genuine human state of being that's not being put out there. In other words, it's going somewhere new. So in that same sense of like you're trying to figure out a way so that you can move to any position. And then you're trying to resolve physical problems by being able to move to any point in your body and resolve those issues, right? And then in your psyche, you're moving again to the kind of the sore points, and you're trying to open them up so that they're not creating problems for you, right? Because when you have a sore point that's protected, all anyone has to do is figure out where the source point is and then go after that. And then all you're doing is protecting. So I feel like I'm kind of playing musical acupuncture. Even if I'm playing a well-known song, there's usually a way of approaching it that's just a little different. That's kind of poking at it a little bit, So, and I think definitely in the music that I tend to write, it's very much a more pointed poking going on there. I'm usually pointing to something that no one wants to look at. That's where I tend to go. So I don't know if that's just a big rationalization for continuing to do music, because it certainly doesn't. The main benefit, as I see it, also is that it gives me a break from thinking. So that's why I've really been enjoying kind of just playing more jazz-oriented stuff. And, just playing. Playing is... It's really, they say like the cat plays with the mouse. There's an incredible amount of learning opportunity in playing. And, allowing the mind to let go of all these concerns, having a place where you can go where you're playing with things that are outside of this intellectual realm. It's really important, I think. Particularly if you're involved in the intellectual realm, you need somewhere else to go. You can't, there is actually a Taoist passage that says something like, if you go full blast in your mind all the time, you will fall apart. It's not said that way. It's said far more elegantly, but that's the basic message. So you need a place of reprieve. You need a place to balance out the mental activity. So I think that creates a general map of the territory that I woke up thinking about this morning, and which I hope you find of some interest if anything comes up regarding any of this. I hope you'll drop me a line. And if you'd like to support these efforts, there are links in the show note description. Thanks for your attention. Adios.